At 5:30 p.m. on the 22nd of April 1915, the Allied troops holding the front line here, just north of the Belgian town of Ypres, were confronted by an eerie sight. A yellowish-green cloud was drifting towards them, carried by a light breeze. As soon as it reached them, their eyes began to stream. Men clutched at their throats as they struggled for breath. Soon they began to retch, and some coughed up blood. A few brave souls stood their ground, but hundreds panicked and fled. It was the world's first use of gas as a weapon of war. There were over 8,000 Allied casualties. Many had been blinded by the gas. Better a sudden death, wrote one British officer, than this awful agony. Many of those who witnessed that first gas attack were appalled. One British soldier wrote, "The whole civilized world ought to rise up and exterminate those swine across the hill." Even some Germans were horrified by what they had done.
I do not like the idea of poisoning men. Of course, the entire world will rage about it, at first, and then imitate us.
He was proved right. The British Commander-in-Chief, Sir John French, wrote to the Minister of War, recommending that Britain should respond by developing chemical weapons of her own. Stalemate was driving both sides to desperate measures. A huge swathe of northern France lay in German hands, and for the French there was only one priority: to push the Germans out by mounting a full frontal attack. The British were sceptical. Lord Kitchener, Britain's Minister of War, feared that the German lines in France were too strong to be broken. Some favoured campaigns elsewhere, weakening Germany by attacking our allies, Turkey and Austria. But the French wanted the Germans off their soil, which meant attacking them in France. Kitchener was right to be nervous about attacking on the Western Front, but because of Britain's commitments to France, there was no other way. Sooner or later, the war would be won by climbing the dreaded parapet and advancing across no man's land on the enemy. On the 10th of March 1915, the British Army launched its first big attack of the war. At 7:30 in the morning, near the little village of Neuve-Chapelle, 340 guns began the heaviest bombardment the British Army had ever seen.
The guns started like all the furies of hell. The shells were whizzing right over our heads and we got more and more excited. We thought the bombardment was winning the war before our eyes, and soon we would be pouring through the gap.
As the bombardment ceased, the infantry went in. Shellfire had virtually annihilated the German defences, and the village of Neuve-Chapelle was taken within an hour. The British, it seemed, were on the verge of a breakthrough. But the bombardment had missed a tiny section of German trench just here, in front of the village. And 2 machine guns, each manned by 4 men, had survived. This gun has a range of 2,000 meters, and it can fire 450 rounds a minute. The infantry didn't stand a chance. As 1st Middlesex and 2nd Scottish Rifles attacked out of the mist, they were mown down. The Scots went into battle with about 700 men. 469 of them were killed or wounded. The British called the offensive off after 3 days. But the battle had unnerved the Germans. For the first time in the war, their front line had been broken. So they began to build a heavily defended second line, behind the first and out of sight of it. The front was growing deeper. Sir John French was convinced that his troops would have done better at Neuve-Chapelle if only his guns had had more ammunition. He reckoned that he needed 50 rounds per day for each of his field guns, and he was lucky to get 10.
Charles Repington, a war correspondent and personal friend, had been staying with Sir John here in France. And on the 14th of May, the Times published an article based on Repington's interviews with the Commander-in-Chief. It concluded that lack of shells was the principal reason for British failure, and blamed the government for not supplying Sir John with the tools of victory.
French's claim of a shell shortage was no mere excuse for defeat. In 1915, the main source of Britain's shell production was the Royal Arsenal here at Woolwich. Dating from the 17th century, it was geared to meeting the demands of the tiny pre-war army, and was quite incapable of feeding the increasingly hungry Western Front. The article sparked off what became known as the shell scandal. It helped bring down the government. The coalition which replaced it included a Ministry of Munitions dedicated to increasing shell production. The British had finally recognized that this was an industrial war, where workers were as crucial to the war effort as soldiers. But trained soldiers were also in short supply. The British Army had begun the war with 250,000 men. By the summer of 1915, more than half had been killed or badly wounded. Despite mounting casualties, enthusiasm for the war remained undiminished. Rudyard Kipling, Britain's much-loved poet of empire, summed up the mood.
For all we have and are, for all our children's fate, stand up and take the war. The Hun is at the gate.
One morning I heard a piper going down the street, and I looked out. There were about a dozen men walking behind the piper. The next morning the piper came down again, and there were about 100 or so behind him, and the third morning there were about 1,000 men marching behind him. The men with bowler hats signifying that they were bank clerks, stockbrokers or accountants, and mixed up with those carpenters and bricklayers and miners with the shilling caps on. So every day the crowd got bigger and bigger and bigger. And when I saw that poster of Kitchener pointing his finger at one, no matter where you were, that finger was pointing at one, I thought, well, I'll take your advice, I'll join up.
When I got home and told my parents that I'd joined up, my mother called it ridiculous, it's old enough. Well, of course, I was still only 15. I wasn't 16 until the December. But of course, my father, different fellow altogether, all right, let him go if he wants to go. Do him good, kind of thing.
By the summer of 1915, nearly 2 million men had volunteered. But it would take many months of training to turn Kitchener's raw recruits into soldiers. In June 1915, Allied leaders assembled to discuss plans for the autumn. Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, was a man of simple tastes, and they met here, in his modest villa at Chantilly, near Paris. The mood was bleak but resolute. The Germans were still on French soil, and would have to be kicked off it. Despite the failures earlier in the year, there was no real talk about changing tactics. The recipe would be more of the same, and this time the British must play a fuller part. Joffre's plan was to cut off the section of German line that bulged out towards Paris. The French would advance from the south. The British would attack in the west. They would be advancing across open country towards the little mining town of Loos. On the 12th of July, Sir John French came up here, to Notre-Dame-de-Lorette, to look at the ground over which he was being asked to attack. He didn't like what he saw. It would be easy for the Germans to defend this industrial sprawl, with its miners' cottages, slag heaps, and mine workings. He decided not to attack. Joffre remained adamant. Still, Sir John refused. Then Kitchener intervened and spelt it out for him with chilling logic.
We have decided that we must act with all our energy and do our utmost to help the French, even though by doing so we suffer very heavy losses indeed.
Kitchener's orders were clear enough. Reluctantly, Sir John wrote to Joffre, agreeing to an attack he didn't believe in. Everyone who knows the ground, he told his staff, is sure that success is impossible. 75,000 British troops would attack the German front line at Loos. When the line was broken, reserves, mostly volunteers of Kitchener's new army, would move up in support. The battle would be commanded by General Sir Douglas Haig, who wanted the reserves close by, so that he could call on them quickly when he needed them. But Sir John French, his superior, disagreed. He insisted on keeping the reserves further back, under his command. French feared that Haig would use them too soon, throwing them into a battle for which they were ill-prepared.
Sir John had never quite convinced himself that Loos would work. Mounting casualties affected him deeply, and he wanted to be sure that the line really was broken before the reserves went in. Kitchener had ordered him to attack, but neither Kitchener nor the British public would forgive him if all this fresh blood was spilt in vain.
Kitchener's volunteers set sail for France in late August, still innocent of the business of war. With them was an 18-year-old named John Kipling, only son of the poet Rudyard. John had been rejected twice by the army on the grounds of poor eyesight, but his father had pulled strings and got him a commission in the Irish Guards. On the night of the 23rd of September, the reserves began their journey to Loos, 30 miles away. Few of them had ever seen the front line or heard a shot fired in anger. At dawn on the 24th, it began to rain. That day, many of them had the last decent meal they'd ever eat, and slogged on, over the cobbles and into the rain, towards the gun flashes on the horizon. Both Sir John French and Haig knew that the bombardment wouldn't be heavy enough to crush the German defences, and had something else in mind. Something that would not merely help them win the battle, but would wreak vengeance on the Germans. They would use gas. When the gas actually hisses out into no man's land, what happens then?
Well, the gas pumped out of these cylinders and went over the parapet, and it disappeared towards the German lines, this great yellow, greenish cloud gradually billowing over towards the Germans. But if the conditions are calm, the chlorine would flow into any kind of depression, so of course it would sink into German trenches, and that was the idea behind the release of it.
What did it actually do to the human body?
Well, chlorine is primarily an irritant, so it stings your eyes. It stings your throat, your nose, makes you cough, and it hurts too. And the chlorine, once it's inside your respiratory tract, it dissolves in the fluid in there, and it irritates and damages the cells and causes bleeding. So soldiers who were exposed to the chlorine were reported as coughing up blood and this greenish mucus. And this is simply the chlorine and the damaged tissue that they're coughing up.
Could the Germans protect themselves against this?
Yes, the Germans had some protection. They had a little pad. This was what the average soldier had, and this was impregnated with a chemical. So the soldiers would use the pad, put it over their mouth, tie it behind their ears, but there would also be a clip which they would use up against their nose, and the pad would offer limited protection. They also had a face piece because chlorine irritates your eyes. So they would wear this mask, but as you can see, it would be very difficult to have this tight fitting. So I'm sure that many of them would have got chlorine into their eyes as well.
When all's said and done, though, this really hinged on the wind direction.
Oh, the wind is absolutely crucial. Ideally, you would want a wind speed of about 4 to 6 miles an hour. Anything more than that, and it's too turbulent and it breaks up the gas cloud. If it's blowing any slower, the gas is going to be sluggish and not move the distance you want it to. The worst condition of all, of course, is if the wind changes direction and blows towards you, and in that situation you have your own troops gassed.
From the folly in the garden of his chateau, Haig could see the front line at Loos. It was only 10 miles away. He was out here just before 5 a.m. and asked his senior aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Fletcher, to light a cigarette. They both watched the smoke. Haig wrote in his diary that it drifted slowly towards the German lines and that the leaves of the poplar trees rustled gently. But if the wind changed, the gas would be blown back onto the British troops. It was an agonizing decision, but 15 minutes later, Haig's mind was made up. The attack was on. The infantry had been issued with masks, so that they wouldn't be asphyxiated by their own gas. The woolen hoods were soaked in a chemical, but would offer only a few minutes protection from the chlorine. And they were hell to fight in.
Well, you can imagine a piece of cloth that just fitted your head. Come right down your shoulder and you tuck it in and under your coat to keep the gas coming up. 2 little slits. You're not getting any air in it at all. And you're wearing that for maybe half an hour or an hour, you don't know. But can you imagine being suffocated like that? You want to pull the darn thing up.
The gas attack was set for 5:50 and would last for 40 minutes. Then the troops would go in. Along a mile-wide front, engineers turned the taps on 5,000 chlorine cylinders. At the northern end of the battlefield, things went badly wrong. The gas whistled out into no man's land, formed a cloud, and then started to blow back into the British trenches.
The wind turned and turned out that gas back onto our people, onto our trenches. And instead of the Germans getting the gas, our own fellas got it.
The gas caused chaos in the trenches. But when the whistles went at 6:30, the men attacked anyway. They were fighting blind. The gas hung in a thick pall over everything, wrote one officer, and it was impossible to see more than 10 yards. The British were advancing by rushes, each platoon running forward, covered by the fire of another. A platoon commander blew his whistle to order his men on, but not a soul followed. He shouted, "You bloody cowards! Are you going to let me go on my own?" His platoon sergeant, groaning with a broken shoulder, shouted, "Not cowards, sir, willing enough. But they're all effing dead." The machine gun had caught them as they rose to the whistle.
It was a shock, really, because although we knew we were in attack, we didn't expect the losses were going to be like they were. The men were sprawled out all over the wire, the barbed wire, just like mothers washing on washing day.
Elsewhere on the battlefield, the gas attack was successful.
Here in the south, opposite the town of Loos, things went quite well. The gas surged out into the German lines and lay low in that valley. At 6:30, when the whistles blew up here, over 10,000 men of 15th Scottish Division poured down this slope. The Scots made good progress. The gas had caused havoc in the German trenches. Some defenders had simply run away, others surrendered without a fight. Within an hour, the Scots had broken through the German first line and were pouring through Loos.
Shellfire had already wrecked the town, but astonishingly, there were still civilians in Loos. One of them, 17-year-old Emilienne Moreau, witnessed the attack.
A thick fog hung over the plain. It was a strange yellowish cloud which made me cough and my eyes water when I breathed it. Strange beings swarmed out of the mist. The grey figures had enormous round eyes and hoods over their heads. They were shouting words I didn't understand, while brandishing bayonets, smeared with blood.
The Scots pressed on through the village and swept up the slopes of Hill 70 behind it. But as they reached the crest of this hill, artillery and machine guns in the German second line opened up on them.
When we got over the double Hill 70, we went down towards the German lines, and we could see the German artillery, the Germans feeding shells into their guns and firing them at us. Our artillery didn't manage to silence those German guns.
It was late afternoon, and the Scots could get no further without help. But if the reserves arrived, they might just break through.
By now, the reserve should have been marching down this road through the village of Vermelles, just behind the British front line. But they were nowhere to be seen. John Kipling scribbled a letter to his father that evening. He noted the time. It was 5:30. He noted another detail too. They were still 9 miles from the front line.
Just a hurried line as we start off tonight. The guns have been going deafeningly all day, without a single stop. We have to push through at all costs. They are staking a tremendous lot on this great advancing movement, and if it succeeds, the war won't go on for long. Well, so long, old dears. Dear love, John.
The chance of success was slipping away. The reserves were needed now. But they'd received the order to advance too late, were too far away, and would not reach the battle in time.
The reserves drifted in during that night and the early hours of the following morning. They finally attacked at 4:30 on the afternoon of the 26th. advancing on the German second line in the woods behind Loos. The machine guns opened fire at 1,500 yards. The Germans saw men falling in their hundreds, but the British pressed on. The few that made it to the German wire could get no further.
The British lost 8,000 men in just an hour. It isn't easy to grasp, but every 5 seconds, 11 British soldiers were killed or wounded.
John Kipling was killed late on the afternoon of the 27th. With the light fading, a comrade saw him stumbling around in a confused state. He seemed to have been hit in the face. Having tried to protect the reserves from unnecessary losses, Sir John French found himself blamed for the loss of the battle. In December he was sacked. Sir Douglas Haig replaced him.
Loos cost the British Army more than 43,000 casualties. The Germans called it the Leichenfeld von Loos, the corpse field of Loos. Many of the dead are buried here. But after the war, there was so little left to identify many of the bodies that they're commemorated on this memorial to the missing. Amongst the names is that of Lieutenant John Kipling, killed on his first day in his first battle.
His parents spent the rest of their lives trying to find the body of their only son. They never did. The loss of John changed forever Rudyard's view of the war. In 1918 he wrote, "If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied."
"1915 had been a year of painful lessons. When the Allied leaders met in December that year, they decided that 1916 would be the year of the Great Allied Offensive. But as they planned their attack, the Germans strengthened and deepened their defences. Earth was giving way to concrete. The Western Front was setting hard.